Boa tarde, good afternoon. Nós vamos dar início à segunda sessão, no segundo dia, presencial. Esta mesa intitulada Reunião, Produção de Evidências Científicas baseadas em análise empírica, Gathering, Producing Scientific Evidence Based on Empirical Analysis. E para compor esta mesa, para tratar deste assunto, nós contamos com os pesquisadores Samantha, Laporte, da Universidade de Lille, Fien De Latte, da Universidade de Ghent, não sei se eu tenho sido devidamente, Bert Cappelle, da Universidade de Lille, e Pâmela Travassos, que é da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, e professora da Rede Pública de Ensino, né, do Rio de Janeiro, da Secretaria Municipal do Rio de Janeiro. Também professora substituta da UFRJ. Bem, the first talk is about corpora and construction grammar. Samantha Laporte holds a PhD in English linguistics from the University of Lille and is currently an assistant professor at the University of Lille. She is also affiliated with the Center for Linguistic Corpus for English Corpus Linguistics at the University of Lille. Então, a professora Samantha Laporte, doutora em Linguística Inglesa pela Universidade de Lille e atualmente é professora assistente da Universidade de Lille. É também afiliada ao Centro de Linguística de Corpus Inglês da Universidade de Lille. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction. So good afternoon, everyone, and also thank you very much for having me here. So as part of this roundtable, I initially gave myself a very broad title, Corporate Construction Grammar, because I wanted to talk about a particular kind of empirical approach, corpus linguistics, to produce scientific evidence within a specific theoretical field, namely that of construction grammar. But I should have given it a subtitle, namely on the value of sophisticated quantitative methods and fine-grained qualitative methods in construction grammar. And the backdrop, so for my talk here, is kind of the infamous quantitative versus qualitative approaches in linguistics, and is also partly inspired by my own journey and relationship to methods over time. And this relationship has evolved and can be summarized a bit summarily by, say, two memes. The first one being this one. And so basically, when I started out a good 10 years ago, the quantitative turn in linguistics was well underway, and I came in contact with much research that would make use of a lot of sophisticated statistics, and I was very much dazzled by those studies. And somehow that came with a bit of an impression that these quantitative, sophisticated approaches were maybe a bit more valuable than more qualitative ones, or those that would rely on more basic quantitative methods. And so being interested in those methods, I trained in them. And so, of course, they are extremely useful, no doubt about that. But training in them also demystified them a little bit. And so that then brought me to my second relationship here, summarized by the second meme, where that has come for me to realize that, well, qualitative analyses have just as much to bring to producing scientific evidence in linguistics. Okay, so now to give that a slightly more scientific backdrop, so here the starting point is, yes, the quantitative turn within within linguistics, more generally speaking, and that, depending a bit of whether we're talking about corpus linguistics or cognitive linguistics, started in, say, the late 90s, early 2000s. And it's good, when we think about construction grammar, to remind ourselves that it's a framework that was initially built introspectively, right, until the roughly early 2000s, where the approach became increasingly empirical, among which quantitative corpus methods were developed. Now, by contrast with that, what has also been noted more or less recently is that more qualitative approaches have taken a hit. And there are several studies that have shown that, looking at papers in linguistic journals. And of course, the question may be, is that a good thing or not? And I like what Larson and Dow have to say about that. What they say is that the increased statistical focus has come at a cost, namely a diminished focus on linguistic description, symptomatic of increasing distance from the language that is the object of study. And that also, for me, squares relatively well with my own experience of reading sometimes papers where you have, say, many plots and all that, but very little for few examples and, yeah, not all that much proper linguistic things to look at, let's say. And so against that backdrop, my goal here is to also, have a roundtable break discussion around the fact that so make a case for the value of both, of course, sophisticated methods, but also more fine-grained qualitative methods here with the scope of contributing scientific evidence in construction grammar. And so to discuss that, I would like to talk about two case studies that I have worked on that revolve around two cornerstones of construction grammar. The first one being the principle of no synonymy, and the second one being that on the role of argument structure constructions versus verb-specific constructions. And in the first one, we took a more quantitative approach with a bit more stats, and the second one, barely any stats at all. Okay, so talking about the first one, I'm here reporting on the work that I also carried out with two colleagues, Sue Larson and Larissa Goddard from Northern Arizona University. So here, starting point is the principle of synonymy in construction grammar, which states that if two constructions are syntactically distinct, so there's a difference in form, they must be semantically or pragmatically distinct. There must be a difference in meaning, basically. This has been posited relatively early on in cognitive linguistics in general. Langacker gives the example of the dative alternation. If you take the sentences, Bill sent a walrus to Joyce versus Bill sent Joyce a walrus, he argues that there's a difference in construal of these two of the same event with differences in emphasis. So where the recipient is emphasized more in the first than in the second. Okay. Now, this principle has been to some extent criticized or questioned a little bit, and Ulrich says that the principle is overrated. He gives a number of arguments, but one of them is that he says that there's a bit of a lack of specification as to what counts as syntactically distinct. So he points out that even in Goldberg's work, there may not be, that is not always clear. So for instance, if we look at the formal realization of relative clauses, and then she knew that, she would have to take a look, or she knew she would have to take a look. Does that count as syntactically distinct or not? And so basically what it suggests is that the principle of no synonymy may hold at certain levels of abstraction, but potentially not at others. So that's the background against which we conducted our case study, whose goal was to test that principle across different levels of abstraction. And so looking at the question of at which levels of formal description does a difference in form also come with a difference in function. Our objective study for that was subject extraposition, so that's an information packaging construction with an anticipatory it clauses and an clausal subject, as in it is essential that they wash their hands, it is argued that blah, 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 it seems that blah, blah, blah. Importantly and interestingly, what literature has reported on this is that these structures serve rhetorical functions, like hedging, evaluation, reporting, and the like. And so that was a starting point in terms of data and methods. We worked on a sample of roughly 1,500 tokens from the British National Corpus. And here gets the interesting aspect. We annotated first form and at different levels of abstraction, since we wanted to look at that as a factor. So in terms of levels, we distinguished between 3 levels. a first more abstract level with the subject or complement structure, and it is important to, or it is the case that, so important and the case are complements, subject complements here. Subject verb structure, so it seems that, and then the passive counterpart, as in it has been shown that. Now, importantly, since the idea here is also to discuss methods, note that we here only selected the top 3 patterns, so that includes only, in a sense, 95% of the data. Part of that is because what you do with very low occurrence technicals. That was the first level. At the second level, we specified for the first construction the form of the complement. So is the complement adjectival or nominal, as in it is clear that, or it is pushing that. Okay, so difference in form there. And then finally, at the third level, we looked at far more fine-grained patterns where we specify the form of the different arguments, typically the clause, the that clause, the WH clause, and the ING clause, and the like. All right, so that was for form. Regarding function, our starting point were 3 main functions identified in the literature. And so those were the functions, one of attitude marking, so where there's some kind of stance, as in it is important to, hedging, as in it would seem that, or observation, so basically some kind of relatively neutral reporting, as in it is shown in figure 2 that. Okay, so 3 main functions here. Note that here too, we actually selected the top 3 functions that were identified. So here too, we narrowed down the data set that we worked with. And so we are in the end working with 86% of the data points. Okay, so then came the statistical analysis where we made use of multinomial regression modeling, namely at each level of form. We sought to predict function based on form. Note, since we started out with only 3 functions, well, we complemented that with a qualitative analysis to see then, can we find more subtle functional differences at lower levels or not? Okay, so then turning to the results, here at level 1, there was actually a very clear mapping between each function and each structure. So the passive structure is strongly associated with the observation function. The subject verb pattern is strongly associated with the hedging function, and then the subject verb complement pattern is highly associated with the attitude function. So each time that roughly 80% of the instances are associated with a particular function. And so this suggests that here we have a pretty clear case for the principle of no synonym holding. Very well. And then looking at the second case, one thing here that that you don't see is that actually the adjectival structure is much more frequent than the nominal structure. So there may well be the case that it kind of takes over in terms of what you see in terms of preferred function. And so here we again try to see whether they still mapped onto the attitude function identified at the level above. And actually it's not the case. I mean, it's the case for the adjectival structure, which is highly associated with the attitude function. But then the nominal structure is actually way more strongly associated with the observation function, as in it is an accepted practice in dire situations. So here we do see that we do get 2 different preferences in terms of function. And so it looks like that higher level may not be the best level of description, and that this distinction here is relevant. Now, once you see that we have 2 observation functions. So the question here was, if we look a bit more closely, do we find differences or not in terms of function? And we did, okay? And so this is something that we did by, looking at the data more qualitatively, trying to see, do we see semantic patterns standing out? And so it turned out that with the passive, 80% of the verbs that occurred in that structure were verbs of reporting or cognition, as it has been suggested that. And so here we have speakers attributing an observation to some external source. It's an indirect kind of or impersonal observation. By contrast with the nominal structure, where you have something that is way more direct as an observation. So here too, with more, a more fine-grained distinction, we see that the principle of no synonymy does hold. Then comes the last level of abstraction with far more fine-grained distinctions. And so here, in short, we did find one small, more fine-grained distinction, but it does not hold. So the principle of no synonymy doesn't hold for all the different patterns here. So what we saw is that, so for these structures here, we did find two groups. So the ones with a double UH clause, so when, what, how, are actually very often negated, as in it is not obvious why. It remains unclear how, etc. While the ones with the other formal clauses are, say, more general or neutral in that respect. So here too, we found a semantic preference at that level. But beyond that, we did not find any differences for the other patterns, which suggests that the principle seems to break down at this lower level of realization. Okay, so those were, our main findings, but what do we make of this in terms of some methodological reflections? First of all, and this is something that I've also seen in different ways in other papers, there's a bit of a focus on the most common forms and functions. Sometimes that also takes the form of grouping together things that could be broken down because statistically speaking, if you have too many distinctions, it becomes hard to work with. So basically here, part of the data is unaccounted for. Second thing, the more fine-grained functional distinctions that we arrived at were via a more, fine-grained qualitative analysis of the data. And then finally, a bit of a thing to think about is, well, have we truly excluded any more fine-grained functional distinctions between the formal patterns? That's really hard, right? You prove a negative. How does one do that? But then to the question, would quantitative methods help here? I'm not sure, right? These are theoretical considerations that, some more sophisticated methods may not necessarily bring an answer to. Okay, so that was the first case study I wanted to look at. The second one is one on the role of argument structure constructions and verb-specific constructions as theorized within construction grammar. And so here, the starting point is, the argument structure constructions that have taken center stage, especially since Goldberg 95's work. So what are these argument structure constructions? They are verb-independent constructions that merge with verbs and that contribute some degree of meaning. So one classic example is the transitive construction, where you have a subject, indirect object, and direct object, which comes with an added meaning of transfer. For instance, if you take the verb slice, slice does not inherently have any meaning of transfer, but if you slice someone a piece of cake, you get transfer. If you take a bit of a verb with very little meaning as smurf, if you smurf someone a kiss, you probably give them a kiss, right? Now, the added value of these constructions is that they're highly economical. So they make it possible to posit single lexical entries for a verb. So slice simply has the meaning of cutting something with a sharp object. And then its different patterning or grammatical patterning can be accounted for thanks to the argument structure constructions. So slice the bread, transitive construction, slice her a piece of cake, the transitive, slice the box open, the resultative construction, and so on. Very well. Now, a bit of a limitation here is that you have a bit of a top-down perspective on verb pattern. And it's probably fair to say that some degree of work in construction grammar has focused on this high level of analysis, and lexically has focused on, okay, what are the verbs that are found in a particular construction? but it kind of doesn't really give you the more bottom-up perspective. So if you take a verb like give, we know it occurs in the ditransitive, but in what other constructions does it occur, and at what levels of abstraction? So how much verb-specific behavior is there, and can it all be accounted for can the behavior be accounted for by the abstract argument structure constructions? And so for this, I carried out a case study on another high-frequency verb, the verb make. And high-frequency verbs are relatively interesting here, or pretty interesting objects to study, because in construction grammar, they tend to be associated with one specific argument structure construction. So give, associated with the ditransitive, definitely transfer, and make is associated with the resultative, as in make someone happy, for instance. They're considered path-breaking verbs for those constructions. Now, the counterpart of that, or the other side of the coin, is that they're highly versatile. So if you take make, you can use it in a creation sense, and then make a cake, and the light verb as in make a decision, a statement, or an effort, as a causative verb, make someone do something, a bunch of idioms, and the like, right? So how do these two observations go together, in a sense? So how much verb specific behavior is there? So in terms of data, here I worked with the British component of the International Corpus of English. So all the instances, which is the corpus of 1 million words of both spoken and written data. And so extracted all the tokens of make, which is a little over 1,800 instances that I worked with. And so here, the method that I adopted is a three-pronged, very fine-grained approach. Barely any statistics to talk about, except just a bit of percentages. And so here, so taking this continuum of abstraction, the first step was to assign to each instance an argument structure construction from it. Okay, so what are all the abstract constructions in which it occurs? So here, relatively briefly, in terms of results, it actually occurred in 9 different constructions, so relatively large range. And I said earlier, it's associated with the resultative construction, but actually that only accounts for roughly 25% of its occurrence. So there's way more to say about it than that. Second step was then to establish the more specific constructions. And so for this, I mean, a little bit like what Renata said yesterday, you need a very principled kind of approach if you want to get to that. And so I here use a method developed by Patrick Hans called corpus pattern analysis, which he has developed in a theory of lexical semantics, and which also has a lexicographic goal. And so here, to kind of show you just how fine-grained that kind of analysis is, if you take a sentence like learners make a living from this trade, the first step was to give a formal description with a valence structure. So a subject, an object, and a complement here, that's a prepositional phrase. Then to give semantic values to each of these slots. So we have human, a living under the semantic value of money, and then trade under activity, assign a meaning. So here, human earns money by engaging in some activity. And finally, basically grouping all instances that go together, generalizing over those to get to a specific lexically bound or verb-specific construction. So here, something like human or institution makes money from a particular activity or event. And so here, I mean, this may seem relatively simple, but there was a lot of back and forth in terms of getting to the right level of generalization, for instance, in this analysis. And the results here is that actually I identified 83 verb-specific constructions. So that really suggests a large extent of idiosyncratic, both formal and semantic behavior. Some patterns are pretty broad, so you have a relatively broad causative pattern as just make someone do something, for instance. But then others are more specific. So you have some that specify semantic value as make some sounds and make a noise, make a racket, for instance. Some specify a lexical element as in to make sense of something. And others have a non-canonical form as in make it clear that, for instance, which is a common form associated with make. Okay, so here we've got the abstract constructions, the specific constructions. The third step was to map the specific constructions onto the abstract constructions. And so this is just a very brief overview, but I basically got to a constructicon here where the more verb-specific constructions fleshed out the more abstract constructions, but were necessary or are necessary to account for the specific verb-specific behavior of make. There were a couple of exceptions to that where there was no verb-specific construction beneath it. So that's, for instance, the ditransitive construction, which contributes an indirect object for some other instances. So if you make me my personal dinner, for instance, the ditransitive construction here is the argument structure construction, but it's one that merges with a more specific construction. All right, so what does this kind of tell us, or what do I want to get to here? This is clearly something where only a highly fine-grained manual analysis allowed me to get there, right? So there is really nothing more than simple descriptive statistics here. And a bit of a take-home message here would be that, well, the study of subtle formal and semantic phenomena sometimes require a take on data that are just not afforded by more sophisticated statistical methods. All right, I think I'm timed up. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that this can form the basis of the discussion later on.
Thank you very much, Samantha. The next talk is monitoring the diachronic change in Spanish youth language from a corpus-based perspective. Fien De Latte is currently working as a postdoctoral research at the Department of Hispanic Linguistics at Ghent University. Her research focuses on nominal terms of address in Spanish and adopts a cognitive function and corpus-based perspective. She collaborates on the development of the common corpus in February 2020. She was awarded the Prêmio Duques de Soria de Hispanismo for master's dissertation, which focuses on the formal function and sociolinguistic variation of vocatives in the Spanish of Madrid. Então, Fien De Latte é atualmente pesquisadora do pós-doutorado no Departamento de Linguística Hispânica da Universidade de Ghent. Sua pesquisa se concentra em termos nominais de tratamento em espanhol e adota uma perspectiva cognitivo-funcional e baseada em corpos. Colabora no desenvolvimento do corpus corno. Em fevereiro de 2020, ela recebeu o prêmio Duques de Soria de Hispanismo por sua dissertação de mestrado, que se concentra na variação formal, funcional e sociolinguística dos vocativos no espanhol madrilenho.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. So the main objective of this talk is to explore recent language change within Spanish youth speech from a corpus-based perspective. And more specifically, I will show that we need tightly controlled comparable corpus samples in order to reliably trace sociolinguistic trends from a microdiachronic perspective. So this talk is situated within the domain of sociolinguistics, and more specifically, we focus on Spanish youth speech. So why is it interesting to focus on youth language? Well, teenagers have traditionally been described as linguistic innovators. So they are constantly looking for new innovative linguistic forms in order to distinguish themselves from other generations, more specifically adults. so to distinguish themselves from their parents, from professors, etc. And as such, they are described as active neologizers. Sometimes other generations tend to rejuvenate themselves and they incorporate into their language, into their speech, the new innovative forms created by teenagers. So teenagers need to react against this kind of imitation, and as such, they enter a cycle of action, reaction, action, and they contribute to the language change. Of course, youth or younger generations aren't a homogeneous group. Gender and social class keep on shaping linguistic behavior. And there are some frequently observed gender-linked differences. So on the left, we see that male-linked features are traditionally described in terms of verbal aggressiveness. Male speakers are more object-focused, they are more assertive, and they are traditionally associated with more vernacular stigmatized appearance, whereas female-linked features include effective and sensitive language, they are more person-focused, they are more affiliative, and they promote more prestigious or standard forms. Well, these tendencies are likely slightly mirrored in social class differences. So the lower social classes are typically associated with the promotion and the diffusion of more vernacular or stigmatized variants, whereas upper middle classes tend to use more standard forms. So on the basis of this overview, it is hypothesized that female speakers and upper middle class speakers tend to spread more prestigious and standard variants, and as such they lead to changes from above in terms of above, whereas male gender and lower class speakers tend to use more vernacular variants, and as such they promote changes from below. But given current changes in society, the question arises if these conceptions, these long-standing sociolinguistic assumptions, are still valid and applicable to current speech. So as we have a look, if we take a look at gender, we see that traditional labels of femininity and masculinity have shifted, they are changing, so stereotypical social roles and norms are no longer or are becoming obsolete and are being replaced by more fluid gender norms. We see that in different studies, boys and girls are less differentiated than ever before. Also, social class, there are studies which have observed that certain subgroups of, for instance, the upper class, and more specifically the younger speakers within the upper classes, may lead to the diffusion of more vernacular and stigmatized forms. So social class is changing as well. So very few studies have empirically questioned and tested these hypotheses. So that's why the main goal of this study is to empirically examine the social diffusion of two highly expressive phenomena in Spanish youth speech throughout the 21st century. So I brought you here a small extract, a brief fragment from a conversation between two Spanish teenage girls to show you that the two phenomena we have analyzed are not random. So first we had the intensifiers highlighted in blue, como like que te cagas, fucking, freaking. Tenemos puntazos, these hilarious moments, cuando es super gracioso, super hilarious, so these are intensifiers. And on the other hand, we have focused on vocatives or terms of interest like tia, which can be translated in English as girl. So intensifiers are modifiers which strengthen or intensify the semantic or emotional force of other items, and as such they are highly expressive and productive linguistic items. On the other hand, the vocatives can be defined as nominal or pronominal expressions used to directly address the interlocutor, and they are prototypically intersubjective linguistic phenomena. Importantly, both the frequency of use and the particular types chosen by speakers have been proven to be influenced by sociolinguistic variables such as age, gender, and social class, as we see here. So age, gender, social class influence the frequency with which speakers use intensifiers in their speech and also which intensifiers they use. And the same holds for vocatives. Previous studies have also shown, for instance, that girls tend to use more intensifiers and more vocatives than boys into their daily speech. And also with regard to the specific types, they have been observed specific associations. For instance, female speakers tend to use more affectionate vocatives like mi amor, mi vida, mi cielo. Whereas male speakers that use stronger forms, more subtle vocatives and intensifiers, like cabrón in Spanish, or puto as an intensifier in Spanish. And also social classes, or there are intensifiers and vocatives which are more characteristic of the higher social classes, like topere in Barcelona, or categorici como as vocatives of the Mediterranean upper class, and also lower classes tend to prefer their own typical intensifiers and vocatives. So this overview brings us to the research questions we will tackle today. So first, to what extent do sociological variables such as gender and socioeconomic status or social class influence the diffusion of intensifiers and vocatives in youth speech? So more specifically, we will verify which social profiles are leading the spread of new innovative forms, so which profiles spread linguistic change. And we will also verify if there are interactions between the variables, so if gender and social class are intersecting. Secondly, we will question and test the long-standing sociolinguistic hypotheses. So are traditional sociolinguistic conceptions about the role of gender and social class still valid in today's speech? So more specifically, do girls and upper middle classes practice teachers and standard language, and do boys and lower classes promote more vernacular or stigmatized variants? So in order to answer these questions, we will conduct a real-time comparative analysis, and we're looking at 2 snapshots of youth speech. So first, we've selected data from the column corpus, which is recorded at the beginning of the century. And we will contrast these data with data from the Corma corpus recorded in 2019. So this corpus collects a more recent contemporary youth speech. Importantly, these 2 corpora reflect the speech of 2 different generations. So here we see actually a generational shift. So the column corpus represents the language of the millennial generations born between 1980 and 1996. While Corma represents the speech of the Gen Z, so people born from 1966 onwards. To capture the spirit of these different generations, I brought here 2 pop idols, 2 pop stars who really represent the identity, the values, the norms of each generation. And it's likely that these different identity and generational characteristics are also mirrored in the language use. So here, for the sake of clarity, a timeline with the 2 generations. So we focus on millennials and on Gen Z. Then some more detailed information about the samples. So first, the millennials are represented by a sample from the COLAM corpus, the Corpus Oral y Lenguaje Adolescente de Madrid. Whereas the Gen Z is represented by a sample from the Corpus Oral de Madrid, CORMA, which is elaborated within our team at Ghent University under the supervision of Renata. In this corpus, we only selected conversations from the 2nd generation or the adolescents, because it's a corpus which also includes the speech of other generations. We selected a highly comparable sample, so we selected conversations in such a way that the metalinguistic variables, such as number of participants within the conversations, social profile of the speakers, are constant across the samples. So the only variable that's not kept constant is the time variable that reflects the two generation in order to trace reliably the changes. As regards the delimitation of the phenomena, we have focused on prefixes, suffixes, and lexical items that function as intensifiers in Spanish. Then, on the other hand, vocatives, without going into detail, we can distinguish between three main formal categories, namely nominal terms of address, proper names, and second person pronoun tu. But for this comparable study, we've only taken into account the nominal terms of address. So in total, the data set includes 430 intensifiers and nearly 1,200 vocatives. So in order to answer the first research question, we have implemented a log linear analysis using the GLM package in R. So this statistical method is highly suitable when you work with count data or frequency data, which is exactly what we're doing here, because we're looking for the frequencies of intensifiers and vocatives in combination with more than two categorical variables, which is also the case here because we're looking at gender, social class, and generation. Another advantage of this model is that it not only evaluates the individual effects of the factors, but it also looks for interactions between the variables. So yeah, for the sake of clarity here, I list again the different variables adopted in the model. So we're looking at the phenomenon, of course, if we are dealing with an intensifier or a vocative, the gender of the speaker, the social class, and the generation. So here are the main outcomes of the statistical model. So for the intensifiers, we found a three-way interaction between gender, generation, and social class. So we see that the intensifiers are more complex, show more complex and multi-layered patterns. And we found stronger interaction in general than for the vocatives, because for the vocatives, we didn't find a three-way interaction. So there, the path-fitting model includes two-way interactions. So on the one hand, between gender and social class, independent of generation, and on the other hand, between gender and generation, independent of social class. So let's start with the intensifiers, and here we see graphs of the three-way interaction, so between gender, social class, and generation, and the graphs visualize the normalized frequencies for each group. So overall, there is a very strong gender effect. So in all groups, females use more intensifiers than male speakers. And this trend becomes even stronger within Gen Z. So here we see the Gen Z groups where girls clearly show higher frequencies than boys. And this is also more outspoken in the higher social classes within Gen Z than in the lower social classes. We've also ran post-hoc comparisons, which are used to uncover more specific differences between the groups. And these comparisons show that female Gen Z girls from the higher social class use 7 times more intensifiers than male speakers. Then we move on to the vocatives, where we found two-way interaction. So we start with the gender and social class interaction. And here we see that females use more vocatives in comparison than the boys, particularly in the higher social class. So here we found a significant effect. Post-hoc comparisons show that in higher classes, females use 65% more vocatives than the male speakers. As regards the gender and generation effect, there we found more complex tendencies. So in Gen Z, it is again the girls who use more vocatives. This is a significant effect. But for the millennials, we found the opposite effect. So here we see that the boys use more vocatives than the girls. Comparisons show that Gen Z females use 133% more vocatives than Gen Z males. So this is really a big change over time. So based on this log linear analysis, we can already confirm that something is going on within the speech of Gen Z girls. Now, in order to answer the second research question, we have conducted some case studies. So we've selected particular categories within the intensifiers and vocative paradigm in order to test the hypotheses. So first, do boys and lower social classes promote vernacular variance? For this hypothesis, we will focus on taboo intensifiers and taboo vocatives. And then for the second hypothesis, do girls and upper middle classes spread prestigious and standard language? We will focus on the most frequent and those hip popular in-group types, which is the intensifier motto and the vocative dio. And we will also take a look at more standard generalized forms, such as the suffix isimo and ombre. So here you see the tendencies for the taboo intensifiers. For the millennials, there are very similar frequencies for the higher class boys and the lower class girls, but there is a big change when you look at the Generation Z girls, where the taboo intensifiers are more frequent in girls' speech in general, and more specifically within the speech of the lower class girls. So the sociolinguistic assumption regarding that taboo or more vernacular forms are mostly promoted by boys doesn't really hold in current speech. For the taboo vocatives, you see that for the millennials, the sociolinguistic hypothesis is confirmed. So we see higher frequencies in the speech of boys, and more specifically in the speech of the lower class boys. But Gen Z, a very different picture. Here it is the upper class girls who tend to use more taboo vocatives, like we see here, idiota, in their speech. So again, something is going on with the speech of Gen Z girls. If we now move on to motto, which is the most frequent intensifier in Spanish youth language, we see that for the millennials, the hypothesis seems to be confirmed. So lower class boys and lower class girls use this intensifier most frequently with very similar frequencies. But in Gen Z, we observe very different trends. So here it is, the higher class girls who tend to use this intensifier most frequently. So here we may actually observe a change from below, so originating in the lower social classes. This intensifier has spread into the speech of the upper class girls. Here we see the tendencies for the most frequent vocative dio, which has become even more productive and frequent in current speech, where it shows really high frequencies. More specifically in the upper class girl speech within Gen Z. Here again, it's important to note that dio is actually a vocative that emerged in the underground, so the lower class circles in Madrid in the 70s, and in the 80s and the 90s, so the years afterwards, it spread into the different younger generations, so across all social groups. And nowadays, it is clearly a very frequently used vocative within the speech of high upper class girls. So here again, we're facing, or we are dealing with a change from below. And we end our case studies with the most standard or neutral forms. So within the intensifier paradigm, we've selected the suffix isimo, which is a generalized neutral morphological intensifier within the inventory. So here for the millennials, it is mostly the upper classes, both boys and girls, who tend to use this intensifier most frequently. So here the sociolinguistic assumption is confirmed. So the lower class girl, the higher class girls, sorry, use this standard form more frequently. But in the Gen Z, we see the opposite. So here it is the lower class boys who use this intensifier more frequently. So the conception or the hypothesis is not confirmed. And then finally, the vocative hombre is a generalized grammaticalizing vocative in general colloquial Spanish, where it's also used to address women. Here we see that in Gen Z, it is not used at all by girls, which may have to do with the inherent masculine semantics. Hombre in Spanish means man, so that may be the cause, or that may explain why girls don't use this vocative. But it is surprising to find high frequencies within the lower class boys, because it's a standard neutral variant, so we would expect to find it more frequently in the higher classes, speech of the higher classes and the speech of girls. So let's move on to the conclusions. We've seen that girls, particularly from the upper class of Gen Z, tend to be the main agents of the fusion. So we see that they are creating their own female identity through the use of taboo forms or vernacular forms. And the boys seem to react in a way resorting to more neutral morphological standard forms like isimo or hombre. And this may also have to do with the expressivity, as we will see with all the different types. But in brief, and some these sociological hypotheses regarding the female and upper class association with more standard prestigious variants, whereas males and lower classes promote vernacular variants, don't seem to hold anymore in today's speech. So, as we've already mentioned, the degree of expressivity seems also to play a role within the construction of linguistic identity for the speaker. So, we see that girls tend to use more frequently more expressive, stronger forms like taboo or vernacular intensifiers and vocatives. Boys seem to react, they resort again to morphological and standard forms, so they enter a cycle of action, reaction, action, which enhances and strengthens the linguistic change, so the speed of the language change. We've also seen that this chain reaction goes beyond the categorical limits, so we've seen the same trends, the same tendencies for both vocatives and intensifiers. We would also like to link these results or these trends with broader socio-cultural changes or tendencies. So as for gender, we are now in a period of empowerment of women. There are lots of attention to gender inequality. So we're facing a redefinition of the role of women in today's society, which may explain this leading role of the Gen Z girls in language change. As for social class, I would like to refer to the theory of distinction, of the French sociologist Bourdieu. And according to this theory, the upper classes are constantly looking for new innovative symbols of their elites, so of their class. Of course, the lower classes tend to imitate these symbols, and as a reaction, the upper classes, the higher classes are looking for new innovative forms, so in order to protect their exclusivity and their identity. So here again, we can observe an action-reaction-action chain that goes beyond the different linguistic categories and beyond gender and social class. I would to wrap up, I would like to outline some future research directions. So first, I would like to acknowledge that this is a limited sample. So it would be interesting to look if these trends are also observed within larger corpus samples. I would also like to highlight the importance of the individual speakers. So in line with their traits sociolinguistics, we consider speakers as stylistic agents, which play an active role within their identity construction. Also, the social networks in which speakers are engaged may be important, for instance, the school context or social media communities. And of course, there's also other individual related factors, such as personality traits, how extroverted, how open to new experience is a speaker. And then to conclude, so this is the last point, I would like to discuss some current and future challenges within the study of youth language. So first, there's the issue of capturing rapid language change. So youth language is constantly evolving, rapidly changing. Sometimes new slang forms appear and disappear within months. So how can we capture these trends, these rapidly changing trends? There's also the influence of social media. So there are platform-specific language use and communicative practices, such as TikTok, WhatsApp, Instagram. So every platform fosters their own communicative style. Also means hashtags can appear and disappear very rapidly. Also, the question of data accessibility. So when the communication occurs online in closed groups, how can we have access to this kind of data? And youth language nowadays often blends multiple languages and dialects, so this really challenges standard language categories and analytical tools. So we will need to resort to flexible, context dependent, adapted approaches. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Now, Travassos. Pâmela Travassos, professora de língua portuguesa no programa de graduação da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, que é o substituto. Professora, como disse, da Prefeitura do Rio de Janeiro também, na educação básica. E foi bolsista pelo CAPES-Sprint, né? Atuou na Universidade de Lille, né, sob orientação de Bert Cappelle. Acho que é suficiente, né? Trabalhar no projeto de praticar, avaliar, não me lembro se já falar assim. Obrigada.
Boa tarde, obrigada, Marcia, pela apresentação. Eu fiz as slides em inglês e vou fazer a apresentação em português, pensando em contemplar a quantidade de pessoas, não passou. O título da minha apresentação é Pesquisa Experimental Baseada em Uso e Gramática de Construções, e o meu objetivo é contribuir para essa mesa metodologia experimental, e minha apresentação vai se dividir basicamente em 3 pontos. Análise baseada em usos, a pesquisa experimental e gramática de construções. E aí, o primeiro ponto, né, que eu trago é a análise de dados baseada em usos. E a primeira questão, né, quando a gente constrói Corpora, a gente tem 2 possibilidades. Ou a gente constrói a partir de dados coletados por um pesquisador, ou a gente pode usar um conjunto de dados já... Desculpa. Não, tudo bem. Obrigada. ou a gente pode usar uma base de dados já com vários dados disponíveis online. E aí, construindo Corpora, a gente tem a possibilidade de coletar em diversos ambientes. A gente tem, por exemplo, dados de redes sociais, no Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, dados orais, dados escritos, dados com níveis de formalidade maior ou menor, e dados literários, dentre outras diversas possibilidades, levando em consideração gêneros textuais diversos também. Ou podemos já usar uma plataforma de dados como o Sketch Engine e o Corpus do português. E aí, pensando em dados, em construção de Corpora, eu trago aqui as humanidades digitais, trazendo essa relação de ciências humanas com tecnologias digitais e essa interdisciplinaridade típica da área, levando em consideração áreas diversas, né, no campo da linguística, literatura, história, sociologia, e também ciência da computação, ciência da informação, engenharia, informática, nessa relação de corpo. E aí, quando a gente vai para a pesquisa experimental, a gente tem um passo a passo, alguns pontos para serem considerados. A gente primeiro define qual é a questão de pesquisa, pensa na abordagem literária, na perspectiva teórica, seleciona a literatura, cria uma hipótese, uma metodologia, seleciona uma metodologia adequada, um design de metodologia, e coletamos dados, analisamos os dados, observamos os resultados, interpretamos e chegamos a alguma conclusão. E aí, quando a gente pensa em pesquisa experimental, a princípio, a gente costuma associar a um laboratório, alguém de jaleco, fazendo experimentos com tubos de ensaio, ou experimentos com ratos, né? Mas a gente também tem experimentos na área das humanidades, levando em consideração os cientistas sociais, os linguistas também, que vão também fazer esse tipo de pesquisa. E aí, o primeiro ponto, né, que eu trago é o que seria, então, um experimento. De acordo com o dicionário de inglês de Oxford, a gente tem aí que um experimento seria uma ação ou operação feita, né, de forma a descobrir alguma coisa que ainda é desconhecida. Testar uma hipótese ou estabelecer e ilustrar alguma verdade já conhecida. E aí, esse método experimental, ele precisa, né, ter uma relação de causa e efeito. A gente traz uma relação de causa e efeito. No caso ali, um linguista, quando faz essa pesquisa experimental, ele manipula um fator que é hipotetizado, né, como algo que causa um efeito em uma variável. E aí a gente traz essa relação desse fator que vai influenciar essa variável como a variável independente e essa variável que vai ser influenciada como a variável dependente. E quando falamos de pesquisa experimental, de objetivos de um experimento, diversas palavras surgem relacionadas ao que a gente busca com esse experimento, qual o objetivo da pesquisa. Então, a gente vê, por exemplo, opinião, atitude, emoção, julgamento, avaliação, comportamento, reação, interpretação, que são elementos bastante subjetivos. E aí, uma questão que eu trago é como avaliar questões tão subjetivas, né? O objetivo do experimento é observar o comportamento linguístico de um usuário da língua, levando em consideração uma situação controlada. E aí, pensando nesses termos, né, que aparecem, o primeiro seria de percepção. E aí, Lente, né, de 2010, traz essa consideração sobre a percepção. Para os seres humanos, é a habilidade de associar a informação relacionada aos sentidos, né, com memória e cognição, de forma a formar conceitos sobre o mundo e sobre nós mesmos e guiar o nosso comportamento. Isso significa duas coisas. Primeiro, que percepção depende, é dependente, né, mas é diferente dos sentidos. Isto é, tem alguma coisa a mais que faz, né, uma experiência mental particular. E segundo, que envolve uns processos complexos ligados à memória. E aí, um outro termo, né, que aparece é a atitude linguística, ou, mais especificamente, a atitude sociolinguística, que a gente pode ver como emocional, ou uma resposta emocional ou intelectual de membros da sociedade a linguagens, dialetos, formas linguísticas concretas, aos seus próprios falantes no seu contexto social. E aí, uma outra definição, né, de atitude linguística seria um estado mental de predisposição em relação a uma forma, uma estrutura linguística de um sistema, que pode ser favorável, desfavorável ou neutra, né, e que pode ser relativamente estável e que pode também ter a sua origem em comportamentos coletivos. E com relação à atitude social, como uma organização duradoura, né, de verdades e cognição em geral, endossado com mudança afetiva contra, né, definida como objeto social, que predispõe para uma ação coerente com as cognições e afeições, né, ligadas a esse objeto. E aí, a gente tem a metodologia de pesquisa experimental, que parte de busca de evidências, levando em consideração as percepções subjetivas de usuários da língua, em relação a um determinado fenômeno linguístico. E aqui a gente consegue ver algumas referências ligadas à pesquisa experimental, parece como Fezelt, em 1987, Gonzalez Marques, 2006, Dragger, 2015, e um livro mais recente de Dragger, 2018, de pesquisa experimental, métodos de pesquisa experimental, especificamente em sociolinguística. E quando a gente pensa em pesquisa experimental, a gente também traz essa interdisciplinaridade, né, que também apareceu no campo das humanidades digitais, mas dentro da pesquisa experimental, na área de linguística especificamente, eles também percebem ainda assim essa interdisciplinaridade, porque esse método envolve sociolinguística, muitas vezes, né, pode envolver sociolinguística, psicolinguística, neurolinguística, gramática de construções. E aí, pensando nessa pesquisa experimental, a gente tem alguns elementos a considerar. Primeiro, uma pergunta de pesquisa, os participantes, os estímulos e o modelo a ser considerado. A gente começa, então, com a pergunta de pesquisa. Tendo identificado algo que pode ser interessante para um estudo sociolinguístico, o primeiro passo é decidir, então, precisamente o que seria interessante investigar sobre esse tópico. E a pergunta de pesquisa precisaria necessariamente ser clara e uma pergunta que pode ser respondida. Com relação aos participantes, a gente pode seria interessante, importante levar em consideração, né, que há diferenças individuais entre as pessoas, cada pessoa tem um background de informações que é diferente em relação ao outro. A gente chama esses participantes de sujeitos, de falantes ou ouvintes, dependendo do foco da pesquisa. E, né, dependendo da pergunta de pesquisa, também seria importante considerar a origem do falante, o gênero, a idade, qual a língua materna, se teve contato, né, se teve a oportunidade de estudar outras línguas, participar de cursos de outras línguas. Com relação aos estímulos, os objetos que são usados para causar algum efeito no comportamento dos participantes são chamados de estímulos, né? E aí a gente tem diversas formas de apresentar, né, de usar estímulos. Os estímulos podem ser vozes, né, por meio oral. A gente pode usar sentenças como estímulo ou até imagem. E aí a escolha desses estímulos vai depender da pergunta de pesquisa. Levando em consideração, então, que a gente tem diferentes tipos, né, de estímulos. A gente tem o item-alvo, o estímulo-alvo, que é o objeto de interesse. A gente tem os itens de controle, que servem de ponto de comparação com os itens-alvo. E também a gente tem estímulos distratores, que têm como objetivo, né, são usados como objetivo de distrair o participante em relação ao alvo, né, ao foco da pesquisa, de modo que distrair o participante em relação à hipótese principal. E aí a gente passa, então, a focar, né, nos estímulos distratores, que tem como função prevenir que o participante ele reconheça, explicitamente ou não, o tipo de estrutura linguística que está sendo apresentado na pesquisa experimental. Seria, né, com o objetivo de distrair o usuário da língua em relação ao foco da pesquisa. Nós também sabemos que a experiência do dia a dia, nós sabemos das experiências do dia a dia, que não apenas a tarefa, né, a informação da experiência, da tarefa, mas também informação externa contribui para distrair o leitor, né, o usuário, o participante da pesquisa. É processado em alguma medida, às vezes, né, isso fornece informação adicional que pode ser útil para alcançar um objetivo. A exata natureza, né, dos processos cerebrais que ocorrem para lidar com os importantes detalhes dessa tarefa-alvo observar, né, o quanto de distração pode ocorrer num evento que busca observar um determinado fenômeno a partir da pesquisa experimental. E aí a gente pode pensar quais seriam os possíveis fatores que podem influenciar no comportamento linguístico desse usuário da língua. A gente pode pensar em fatores linguísticos e também não linguísticos, né? Por um lado, a gente tem fatores linguísticos que podem influenciar, como que a gente pode usar, né, podem funcionar como distratores, seria que sentenças focando em diferentes níveis gramaticais do que no estímulo-alvo. Então, se a gente está focando num fenômeno num determinado nível gramatical, um possível distrator seria usar um fenômeno em outro nível gramatical. E pensando em elementos não linguísticos, a gente tem diversas possibilidades de fatores que podem influenciar, como objetos. Então, um simples canguru, né, um ursinho de pelúcia com a bandeira ali da Austrália, num estudo sobre o inglês, por exemplo, talvez fosse influenciar de alguma forma a resposta do usuário da língua, bastando ter presente, né, esse objeto. Sensações físicas do participante, como o participante pode estar com fome, ou com estresse, ou triste, né? E as próprias pessoas que aplicam o teste, também as pessoas que estão presentes no momento da aplicação do teste, podem influenciar de alguma forma. A vestimenta, até o penteado, enfim, tem muitos fatores que podem distrair o leitor nesse momento. E aí, pensando também em outros fatores que produzem um efeito nesse comportamento, a gente tem, de um lado, os fatores internos ao participante, como o grau de familiaridade com a tarefa a ser performada, ou com os elementos linguísticos em questão. A gente leva em consideração, então, questões emocionais, a fadiga, né, a preocupação, o estresse, fome, devaneios, ou mesmo a falta de interesse. E, por outro lado, a gente tem também fatores externos ao participante, né, como uma tarefa que demanda muito de atenção, uma tarefa extensa, o ambiente, elementos visuais ou auditivos, né, do ambiente, a interação social e o grau de atratividade desse objeto de atenção. E aí, aqui a gente tem algumas pesquisas utilizando esse método experimental, levando em consideração diferentes configurações. Então, a gente tem, por exemplo, questionários, leitura de texto, usando sentenças com áudio, preenchimento de lacunas, textos e áudios, enfim, muitas configurações diferentes. E no canto direito a gente consegue ver se esses estudos usaram ou não distrator, e também pensando na quantidade de distratores, que também não é tão certo assim entre os pesquisadores, né? A quantidade de distratores que seria ideal de serem usados. E então, a gente passa para o último ponto do modelo, né? A gente tem ali a configuração do teste e alguns fatores também para serem considerados nessa configuração. Seria ali, se nesse teste a gente usa um questionário aberto, um questionário fechado. O questionário aberto, a gente tem respostas discursivas, curtas, às vezes, que acabam precisando de uma análise qualitativa. mais precisa, né? E a gente tem diversas possibilidades de configuração desse teste, com opções de múltipla escolha, de categorização, escalas de diferenciação, preenchimento de lacuna, questionários sim ou não, são mais objetivos, com resposta metalinguística, respostas curtas, né, discursivas, uma escala de Likert também pode ser usada, que varia em relação ao grau, né, de que você concorda totalmente, discorda totalmente, né, e de leitura também. E a gente tem também o suporte de registro dessa pesquisa, que pode se dar de forma online, pode ser por meio de formulário impresso, pode ser por gravação. E aí a gente tem também teste online e offline, né? O online considerando a medida do tempo e o offline sem considerar esse tempo de reação. E a gente tem também como uma possibilidade, né, de uso de aplicação digital, né, usando Google Forms, por exemplo, que está disponível online. E aí eu trago aqui na questão da gramática de construções, uma perspectiva sociofuncional, cognitiva ou socioconstrucionista, e levando em consideração, né, que construção seria ali um pareamento de forma e função, como que a gente pode usar a pesquisa experimental relacionando ali, né, com essa perspectiva teórica. E a pesquisa experimental associada, né, muitas vezes à análise empírica, ela pode contribuir para a análise e descrição de dados linguísticos, de expressões, de construções, tanto levando em consideração aspectos de forma, fonética, fonológica, morfológica, sintática, como também aspectos relacionados à função, semântica, discursiva, pragmática. E a gente consegue, então, um panorama, um mapeamento de construções da língua por meio, né, dessa pesquisa experimental, de modo a mapear essa rede construcional, né, o conhecimento linguístico do falante. E trazendo também nessa vertente socioconstrucionista da gramática de construções, pensando também na possibilidade de dialetos, na análise sistemática e nas comunidades de fala, trazer também uma perspectiva da análise da variação também por meio da pesquisa experimental, que é uma possibilidade. Observar diferentes formas, né, serviços da mesma função. E uma pergunta, né, seria ali, quais são os significados sociais associados a um dialeto? E aí seria, né, uma pergunta, talvez possível, de responder usando essa metodologia. E aí, alguns estudos que eu trago aqui sobre a pesquisa experimental em gramática de construções no âmbito do Brasil, né? A gente teve Marcia Vieira, Esteves, 2009, a variação entre predicadores complexos simples, predicadores simples e predicadores complexos, como dar parabéns e parabenizar, né? Trazendo a variação também. Penha e Teixeira, 2015, Penha, 2016, 2016, B, 2017, também trazendo a construção com verbo suporte, expressões como dar uma caminhada, dar uma caminhadinha, fazer uma parada, fazer uma paradinha. Travassos, 2016, construções especificamente com o verbo dar com sufixo diminutivo, como dar uma olhada, dar uma escapadela, dar uma crescidinha, dar uma convencida, dar um risinho. E Souza Guerreiro, né, 2021, com construções do tipo ir para o céu, ir para o inferno, ir para as cucuias, ir para o Galileu. E também trago aqui um livro recente, né, de 2022, Praticar com a rede de perspectivas metodológicas, em que a gente encontra 2 capítulos que trazem também essa metodologia experimental. O primeiro é o capítulo 5, a pesquisa experimental análise de construções com verbo suporte, e o capítulo 6, proposta de testes experimentais para análise da variação construcional de predicador complexo. E o que a gente percebe é que muitas vezes a pesquisa empírica e a pesquisa experimental não são, podem muitas vezes ser utilizadas como metodologias complementares, trazendo também aspectos qualitativos e quantitativos, né? Na questão da análise qualitativa, descrições sem números, e na quantitativa, levando em consideração proporções, análises estatísticas, né? E a gente tem muitas vezes o do R, tabelas, né? Gráficos, e a gente muitas vezes leva em consideração os dois tipos de metodologia. Um ponto importante é que a gente pode muitas vezes replicar, né? É importante trazer essa questão de replicar, a possibilidade de replicar o experimento. Isso contribui para a transparência também no processo científico. E aí, com diferentes estudos independentes trazendo essa pesquisa, a gente consegue fornecer evidência que pode apoiar uma determinada hipótese e até fortalecer uma visão, né, de que uma determinada hipótese é verdadeira. Algumas questões éticas ligadas à pesquisa experimental, a gente tem alguns testes, alguns formulários e documentos que são importantes, né, essenciais para a gente fazer a pesquisa experimental. O TCLE, TALE, que é o teste de consentimento livre e esclarecido, e o teste de assentimento livre e esclarecido. Essas resoluções, na CNS, resolução número 466 e /12, e 510/16, o CEP-CONEP, né, a gente tem o Comitê de Ética em Pesquisa, e Comissão, né, de Ética em Pesquisa Nacional, e a Plataforma Brasil, que serve, né, para registrar e processar documentos relacionados a projetos de pesquisa. Há também essa cartilha do participante disponível, que traz ali quais são os direitos dos participantes em relação a quando ele participa, né, de alguma pesquisa experimental. Busca trazer essa proteção ao participante de pesquisa, que envolve seres humanos no Brasil, trazendo ali os direitos e garantias, a confidencialidade dos dados dessa pessoa, garantindo o bem-estar físico e emocional, e de modo a ser minimamente invasivo, né? Garantindo que o processo seja anônimo, né? Que não seja exposto, e essa participação sendo voluntária. E aí, trago também aqui, né, de volta, essa preocupação também, que já apareceu algumas vezes nas apresentações de ontem, a preocupação com acesso aberto, com ciência aberta, com dados abertos, né? Preocupações éticas ligadas às humanidades. E como a gente organiza essas informações no sistema, né? E também na documentação desse sistema, dessas informações. Aí uma pergunta também seria em que medida podemos compartilhar ou reutilizar esses dados da pesquisa experimental? Mais uma pergunta para reflexão, né? E pensando ali no compartilhamento, né, de dados e reuso desses dados voltados de pesquisa experimental. Aqui estão as diferenças. Obrigada.
Agora, a última contribuição aqui na apresentação é de Bert Cappelle, da Universidade de Lille. O professor Bert Cappelle atua na área de linguística inglesa, na Universidade de Lille, e gosta de observar como as construções são usadas para colocar pensamentos em palavras. Na área de gramática de construção, cognitiva baseada no uso, defende a visão de que muito do conhecimento linguístico é baseado em exemplares. Bert Cappelle is Associate Professor of English Linguistics at the University of Lille. Bert, are you listening?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. So the floor is yours. We can hear you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. Sorry that I couldn't make it, physically. Thanks anyway for, allowing me to be part of this roundtable. Well, I'd like to discuss a somewhat recent phenomenon that we're all familiar with, generative AI, ChatGPT in particular. And so the question that I would like to raise is whether and how we can use ChatGPT for our research purposes, and how we can use, if we can use it at all, to gather actual linguistic data. Okay, so I'm trying to navigate my own slides here, which I'm not really managing to do for some reason. Okay, here we go. So I hope you can see this second slide and that I'm not stuck at the title slide as sometimes happens. So the problem that we're facing with is that we don't always know how constructions are organized in the mind. And then an obvious solution to that problem is that we can use psycholinguistic testing. But maybe there's another complementary solution, and that is indeed the use of AI for that. The starting point of this short contribution is the resultative construction. Maybe I shouldn't say the resultative construction, as there are several resultative constructions. That's something that Adele Goldberg and Jackendorf wrote a paper on together. They wrote, "We treat resultatives as forming a sort of family of constructions, sharing important properties, but differing in certain specifics." So one type of resultative construction, one member of that family is displayed here, the woman dressed herself older than she was. Now, I have to say that what I'm presenting here is something that I actually already presented as part of an ABRELIN talk a couple of years back. So I'm recycling some of that, and I will build on that. Here's another example. The magician sawed his assistant in half. What we have here is a particular form. So with a noun phrase, a verb, another noun phrase, and then either an adjective phrase and a prepositional phrase. And we already heard in Samantha's talk that indeed we have these two options. She gave the example there of make, which can be used in, for example, make someone happy. But another example presented on a slide of hers was make oneself at home. So we have the two options there. And the meaning is to, well, roughly, to cause that second noun phrase to become Z, not Z as in Generation Z, but the Z corresponds here to that adjective or prepositional phrase. And then what about the verb? Well, that expresses kind of the manner or the means by which that result is obtained. So I'm going to redo that old familiar trick that I did during that ABRELIN talk. So suppose it's the trick of linking those rings. Suppose that you have the following sentence: the magician sawed his assistant in half. And then as a native speaker of English or as a linguist, if you have this sentence, he pulled a rabbit out of a hat, you can clearly see the connection between those two sentences because they both have this causative meaning. Yeah, although they differ in some respects, as we'll see too. Suppose then you have two further sentences: the magic mirror smashed to smithereens and a white dove flew out of the hat. And yes, all these sentences are from the world of magic performances. That in itself doesn't matter, but well, this last sentence, well, let's take the magic mirror first, that sentence. We have to smithereens and in half, which both express a property as a result. Whereas with a white dove flew out of the hat, this resembles the sentence with he pulled a rabbit out of a hat more clearly because the resultative phrase here expresses a path, a trajectory, something directional. Now, the two latter sentences at the bottom also resemble each other because they lack that aspect of being caused by an external agent. Yeah. So if you like this kind of coming together of those rings as much as I do, I'll give you another opportunity to see them here with the actual constructions as labels. Yeah, so you have transitive property resultatives, transitive path resultatives, intransitive property resultatives, and intransitive path resultatives. Now, this is actually a sort of family of constructions. A family is a well-chosen term because the 4 constructions here, there are actually more resultative constructions. But just taking these 4, they form what is known as a sort of family resemblance category, to use a term that was introduced by Wittgenstein famously. What is meant by a family resemblance category, it's not that all 4 constructions share the exact same number of features. One construction has something in common with another, say, sister construction, while that construction has something else in common with a third construction, and so on and so forth. Now, another way of representing a family of constructions is obviously by means of a tree, a family tree, like a genealogical tree. And this is done here. You know, a tree has the advantage, or maybe the disadvantage, of you know, having branches and having kind of closer connections at the bottom than at the top. So what is represented here is a family tree, indeed, of the resultative construction, where transitivity is seen as the first broad distinction. And then within both branches, you have, you know, the property resultatives and the path resultatives. The property resultatives, and only those, have 2 formal subtypes with adjective and prepositional phrases. So don't dress yourself old. That example that I already displayed has an adjective phrase which expresses a property. It's a transitive kind of resultative, and of course it is a resultative indeed. Whereas the mirror smashed to smithereens has a prepositional phrase, to smithereens, which also expresses a property, but this sentence is intransitive, but it's also a member of the resultative family of constructions. Now, okay, this seems to be the classification or the taxonomy that I presented, but I'm not actually sure that this is how speakers of English also conceptualize that family of constructions in their mind. It's my linguistic representation of that particular family, but is it cognitively real? You know, maybe this is closer to what speakers have in mind, where first the property path distinction splits up that particular family. And in that case, don't dress yourself old and the mirror smashed to smithereens belong closer together. They belong to the first big branch of that family. But maybe that is the correct classification, correct in the sense that it mirrors most closely what speakers have in mind. In fact, there are 6 different ways of classifying this resultative family of constructions. So what I did is, come up with a number of stimuli or potential stimuli. I did that partly with the help of ChatGPT, because after constructing stimuli with real resultative constructions, real resultative, or no nonsense word constructions of the type, the waiter wiped the table clean, I decided to use nonsense words for a variety of reasons, but basically because I thought that if I used actual words, then there was a risk that speakers of English, because the ultimate aim is to ask speakers of English, and this is an experiment that hasn't been carried out yet, but that I would like to carry out with, among other people, Samantha, and maybe also people here in, I say here in Rio, over there with you guys in Rio. So the idea would be to see how actual speakers organize the resultative family of constructions when you present them with sentences of different types of resultative constructions. You know, different sentences. As you can see here, there are different transitive sentences, different intransitive sentences. There are property results, there are path results. Among the property results, we have adjective phrases and prepositional phrases. For the paths, of course, there's only prepositional phrases. And there's a fourth column for animacy, but I realized kind of too late. Well, it's never too late because the experiment hasn't been carried out yet. It's still in its test phase. I realized kind of after having constructed these nonsense sentences that if you use nonsense words like the klurm, as in the sentence, the klurm blinked her up the stairs, we can't really be supposed, or a native speaker can't be supposed to know whether klurm is animate or inanimate. It could be either. So there are some things that still have to be figured out. Another issue is that of course is presented here as a property resultative, but it's not the best example. So some of the examples have to be tweaked. Now, anyway, I asked before I roll this out with actual speakers, I asked ChatGPT to classify these sentences to see whether the experiment, would in principle work. So I asked ChatGPT, you have 12 sentences in front of you. I treated ChatGPT pretty much as I would treat a test subject of flesh and blood. Please consider these examples carefully, considering their meaning and their form, then make groups according to their similarity, according to the similarity of these sentences. You are free to make the groups according to any criteria that you may choose, and you don't need to specify your criteria. You can make as many groups as you want and group together as many sentences as you want to, but please make more than one group and fewer groups than the number of sentences. And take as much time as you want. Of course, ChatGPT doesn't need a lot of time to do that, and it's precisely the sort of task that it seems to love doing. So I'm again somewhat stuck here, but so here's an example of what ChatGPT did. It first grouped 5 sentences, the ones that you can see here. It did give some explanation, although I instructed it to not necessarily do that, but it did it anyway. It's always trying to be helpful, of course. Another group contains 3 sentences, here another 3. And then there was just one group with just one single sentence. She dreamt it to exhaustion, where it says, this sentence describes a subject's movement or transformation into a state. So there are 4 groups here. I asked ChatGPT to do that 5 times over. And then because I fear that because ChatGPT has a memory, it remembers previous conversations that you have with it. I asked my wife and my son to also give it the same instruction that I gave it, and so they did that once on their computer. All in all, there were then just 7 attempts, and what I did was feed or transfer those attempts to an Excel sheet. And this is the outcome of that. The cells seem to contain numbers, but you don't have to treat them as actual numbers like 111. It's really 1, 1, 1. So that means it was treated in the first group in one experiment, and then in another trial again in the first group, and so on. What we see here, and I'm just checking the time here, what we see is that the transitive sentences indeed seem to be roughly grouped together, and the same goes for the intransitive sentences. So that seems to be a basic sort of division that ChatGPT across its 7 attempts makes. But then what about the other variables? Remember that there's, as another variable, whether or not the resultative phrase is a path versus a property, and also whether it's a prepositional phrase or an adjective phrase. I'm not even dealing with animacy here. Well, let's just take one single sentence here. She smelled the net from collapse. What we can see here is that it was grouped 6 times in a particular group, actually the first group, with this particular sentence here: she sculpted the cladge over the ramp. And that may not surprise us because, you know, both sentences are transitive, but also both have a prepositional phrase. They have a prepositional phrase, even though that prepositional phrase in the case of from collapse is a property, and over the ramp is a path. Now that very same sentence, she smelled the net from collapse, has also been grouped 6 times together with she ploughed the thorpe blue, even though from collapse is a prepositional phrase, as we saw, and blue is of course an adjective, but both express a property as a result. I'm gonna roughly leave it here. So that means that what we can see just using ChatGPT is that, yes, transitivity seems to be a major distinction. But as to whether the form of the resultative phrase, adjective phrase versus prepositional phrase, or its meaning, property versus path, is then the next major distinction, that is not so clear from this kind of ChatGPT experiment. Let me conclude so that there's perhaps some time for a brief discussion. ChatGPT apparently can help setting up an experiment, a psycholinguistic experiment in this case, because I mean, it's very good at inventing nonsense words. I didn't come up with those nonsense words. That would have taken me ages. And it can also help us check whether an experiment, once carried out, might actually work. So you can see this as a sort of pilot study. And the good thing is that you can have multiple pilot studies, usually with real experiments with real people. Doing a pilot study is very costly, and if you have enlisted test subjects for a pilot study, you cannot really ask them to do another pilot study. That's not something that you can realistically expect people to do. With ChatGPT, it never seems to tire, so there's no issue here. I think that maybe we might consider taking AI seriously as an aid in collecting empirical data. So what I did here was actually, use ChatGPT as if it were a bunch of real speakers. Of course, we can only take AI seriously if we also compare its judgments with actual speakers' judgments. So that is something still to be done. And that's something that other researchers are also doing and have done to some extent. And that's something that I think would be great to apply to this particular test case, namely the family of resultative constructions. Thank you very much.